Hello everyone and welcome. So today we're going to be covering population ecology and behaviors. So two, I think, really interesting overall topics. We don't typically tend to think of behavior as sort of an evolutionary trait, but I would hope that by the end of today's lecture, you'll see behavior as kind of this weird in-between trait where it's evolutionary, beneficial to have certain behaviors, but other times it's not quite evolution the way we think about it. And so let's dive in. Let's first talk about population ecology as a topic. I'm sorry, behavior as a topic first. So when we're analyzing behavior, we actually have to look at two sort of distinct things. First is what we call proximate causation, i.e. the mechanisms that are the reason for this behavior, i.e. what is causing a tiger to act aggressively towards another tiger, or what causing a dog to act very friendly towards a human, right? That underlying mechanism of aggression, of behavior. And then we can also think about it as in terms of the ultimate or evolutionary causation. Why did this behavior evolve? Behaviors aren't random. They just don't pop up for no reason. So there must be some level of evolutionary benefit underneath of this. Now, when we're thinking about analyzing behavior, there are four distinct levels. We'll think about the physiology, that could be cellular level or other internal factors. The ontology, i.e. how it develops. Phylogeny, how it's related in groups of species that are related, and then the adaptive significance, i.e. its role in survival and fitness. So ethology, as we've mentioned, is the study of ethology is the study of natural history of behavior. Now, there are two distinct types of behavior. The first is what we call innate behavior. It's instinctive, i.e. it does not require learning. So to give you perspective on this, we have a goose here, a Canadian goose. Its instinctive behaviors when it sees a stimulus, i.e. an egg rolling away from its nest. Its natural behavior, again, didn't have to learn this at all, is it physically goes and grabs it and pulls it back into the nest. Now, another case of innate behavior would be humans and sucking. And I don't mean that as like people stink or anything like that. I mean as like babies, we instinctively know how to suck, how to breastfeed, how to bottle feed. Again, that's an innate behavior. It's genetically fixed. It's an action pattern. We do it without even knowing we're doing it. Now, again, in this case, the egg retrieval is a behavioral mechanism triggered in our goose. It's triggered by a key sign or stimulus. Now, in this case, it was the egg out of the nest, but it does provide us with this really interesting mechanism, which we call the innate releasing mechanism, where the precession of a key stimulus and triggering of motor program, i.e. that fixed action pattern. And once the pattern begins, it goes to completion even if the egg is removed. It's kind of a weird thing. Now, this all exists as well as the neurobiology level as well. Now, this is sort of beyond the scope of this course, but I wanted to just leave this up here for those of you that were interested in the neurobiology behind behavior, because I think it's a pretty interesting thing if that's what you're interested in. You can look at things such as techniques of MRIs as well. So if you're interested in the neurobiology stuff, definitely take a peek at those two slides. And definitely if you're interested more in those things, definitely reach out to me or pop onto the internet and do some research, because it is a really fascinating topic, but again, really sort of beyond the scope of today's class. Now, this leads us into something that is something we're going to talk about, which we call behavioral genetics, which deals with the contribution of that heredity makes. Now, I'm sure you guys have probably all heard of the nature versus nurture argument. Nature being something that's genetically hardwired into you, you kind of can't avoid it, versus nurture, i.e. something that you are taught in a social context, and the experiences themselves in that social context guide your behavior. So if you, for instance, live in the country and everyone there likes a specific type of food, you are culturally going to learn that it's probably a good food to do, right? Now, genetic differences are pretty interesting. Now, we can look at artificial selection, i.e. selection by a mouse in a mouse population inside of a laboratory setting. And we can actually see that behavioral differences among individuals do result from genetic differences. So we can look at the total number of errors in negotiating a maze, i.e. how a mouse goes through a maze, or I should say a rat in this case. And this is after 14 trials. And you'll notice that the parental generation has some sort of distribution here. And then the first generation has a slightly different distribution. And you'll notice over time that the distribution really dramatically changes. And the reality of that is in this natural environment where artificial selection is applied, what we're selecting for is the genetic differences that give us these widely different distributions of time to get through the maze. Now, there is some really interesting genetics here that I'd like to just make mention of, which is the FOSB gene. Now, the FOSB gene actually determines whether female mice nurture their young. Now, if you have mice have two alleles of every gene, just like humans do. Now, if you have both alleles of FOSB that are disabled, the mothers actually ignore their young. However, if you are heterozygous or homozygous dominant in this case, you would actually have protective maternal behavior. Now, it's kind of a weird thing, but what's going on here from the maternal level? Well, the protein that FOSB expresses and activates in sort of a network actually affect neural circuitry within the hypothalamus, which is a really important area for behavior in mice. But the idea here is that you can change the genetics, which will change the mother's behavior, which in turn will change the way the offspring behaves. So again, we're changing a gene, or a gene has variation, and it again influences how the mother raises it, which again affects this idea of what behaviors you are taught as an individual. So kind of a cool thing. Now I have another cool example here, which is the prairie and the montane voles. Voles look a little bit like this. They're not very exciting. They're mouse-like creatures. Like they look like moles and mice and those little tiny teeny rodents out there. But it's interesting enough. When they mate, they release two chemicals that humans actually produce as well: vasopressin and oxytocin. Both involved with oxytocin's involved with a lot of things, but it's also involved with love in humans. But vasopressin is involved with uterine function and stuff like that. Now, the interesting thing about vasopressin and oxytocin is that the responses actually differ greatly between the species. Now, in the prairie voles, it actually stimulates a strong bonding pair, whereas in montane voles, it actually doesn't affect them at all. And why is that? Well, again, there's an underlying genetic code between these two species of voles, which in turn leads to a differential response to these two distinct chemicals. And again, so different behaviors based upon underlying genetics. So again, in one aspect, behavior is pretty genetic, right? And we could just look at this some data-wise, where we have the prairie vole and the montane vole. These are just their brains, obviously. But you can look at the pair bonding behavior, i.e. the time they spend together in seconds, where you have the control or those induced with vasopressin. If you want to read a little bit more about this, it's actually a paper published back in 2006, in case you're interested. This is the citation. It's a kind of interesting paper. But you'll notice that the control has less time. It spends less time with their mate versus the one with vasopressin. Only in the prairie voles, but not in the montane voles, telling us again there's a distinct underlying genetic behavior. Now, this leads us from the genetic basis of behavior into the more of the acquired basis of behavior, which really comes down to learning. Right? Learning is not something unique to humans at all. Everything learns. And so I remember when I was younger, we had a cat, and we had this cat for about 20 years, and one time this bird got stuck in our garage where we were living at the time, and the cat was in the garage, and the cat was sitting on top of our car that was in the garage, and the cat was trying to figure out how to go from one area of the garage to the next, and eventually she ended up figuring out, oh, if I jumped on this shelf versus then this shelf, then back on then the top of this shelf, I could get at the bird. And so she was perceiving the cues in the environment and learning based upon her previous behaviors in said garage. So it was actually a really cool instances of a cat really studying the environment and learning about the environment. But again, learning something that humans themselves don't just do, but it's how we alter our behavior as a result of previous experiences. And it's like if I go to grab a cup of coffee and I take a sip and it burns my mouth, well, I know next time not to sip the coffee right away without checking its temperature. And that's what we're talking about here. Now, this does lead to habituation, which leads to decreases in the responses to a repeated stimulus. And sometimes there are no positive or negative consequences to this, but there could be as well. Now, we also have what's called associative learning, where we associate two stimuli or between a stimulus and a response. And so we can condition behavior through association. So I'm sure you guys have probably heard the classic experiment from Pavlov. He rang a bell, gave the dog a treat, thus the dog associated ringing a bell with getting a treat. And you can apply that to any number of situations. Like, for instance, if I say the car ride word to my dog, she knows it's going to be a good time for her. She's going to run to the garage and go for a hop in the car and go for a ride. So That's what we think about associative learning, associating something, a stimulus, with a response, or between two stimuli. Now, there are two classical types of conditioning we see with associative learning, classical and operant condition, and they do differ in the way they work. Now, again, we can think about it just a sort of a straightforward example here. We have a toad and a bumblebee. Now, the toad is hungry, as most toads are. You can see he's kind of pudgy. He eats the bumblebee. He gets stung. The toad knows that's bad to eat the bumblebee. Then it learns not to eat the bumblebee. So that's what we're sort of talking about here. Now, let's talk about classical, or what we technically call Pavlovian condition, where you pair the presentation of two distinct stimuli with an association that's formed between them. Now, in the case of dogs, as I mentioned, you could feed dogs meat powder, where you have an unconditioned stimulus, which is meat. The unconditioned response is salivating. Then the conditioned stimulus is bell ringing. And then the conditioned response, after a time, the dog salivates only with the ringing of the bell. Again, that classic experiment from Pavlov way, way back in the day. Now, operant condition, where the animal learns to associate its behavior with a reward or a punishment. Now, this is classically demonstrated by B.F. Skinner and what he termed as the Skinner box. Now, in this experiment, Skinner actually trained rats to associate pressing the lever, the behavioral response, with attaining food, the reward. And so I'm sure you guys have probably sort of seen that before in some, maybe a cartoon or on a documentary or something, but you can get an animal to push a lever and it'll do, if it gets a reward, they'll keep doing it to try to get the reward. So kind of a fun thing. Now, there also is what we call instincts. Now, these instincts overall govern the learning preparedness. Now, instinct does guide individuals by determining what type of information can physically be learned, and animals may have innate predispositions towards forming certain associations, but not others. But again, we have this overall level of genetics under this, and under all this idea of there is a limit to how much an individual can learn as well. Now, this leads us to an imprinting, where social attachments to other individuals or people develop preferences that influence behavior later in life. So, for instance, we could look at filial imprinting, where it's the attachment between parent and offspring. And the classic example of this is Konrad Lorenz. He won a Nobel Prize in 1973. But you can see Lorenz here training his little duckies to follow them. So he had a filial imprinting. He, i.e., made the ducks think that he was their parent. Obviously, he wasn't, because he's not a duck. But he made the ducks feel like they was his parent. And the ducks would then do what they naturally do, follow the parent, and instead of following a duck, they would follow this man. And I know that might not seem like the most noble Nobel Prize reward-winning work, but again, it really set forth the idea of imprinting as a behavior. Now, these parent-offspring or filial interactions are really important for the normal development of social behavior. It's not just true for us, it's true for monkeys. So monkeys choose clothed mothers over wired mothers with food. So again, that mother's bonding is really important. Again, not just for us, but for other individuals as well. So again, you can see this example here. We have a wire monkey. Even though the wire monkey has food, this cloth monkey looks way more like the natural monkey. Way more like a natural mother monkey here, and thus the monkey is going to bound to this. Now, instinctual and learning may also act as behavioral develops. So for instance, in the white-crowned sparrow males, they sing species-specific courtship songs during mating. Now, there is a genetic template to this. It's an innate program to learn the appropriate song. However, they physically lack the capacity to learn the song unless they hear it at a critical period in development. So kind of a weird thing. It's like learning, like, oh, you can only learn to play, baseball if you learn to play between 9 and 10 years old, right? That's sort of key developmental thing. And you can sort of see this here, where we have the correct frequency of the song, and then you can see that what happens as it's trained when it learns it at the correct time. So again, we see a complete difference in the song times over time. Now, bird songs is a really interesting example of behavior. Now, as I've mentioned with the previous example, bird songs are instinctive at times. However, we can actually look at some other species, for instance, the cuckoo bird here. Now, if cuckoos are raised by different species, as cuckoos are, I don't know if you guys have heard this one before, but cuckoos are what we call brood parasites. So basically, the adult cuckoos trick other birds into raising their offspring for them. Kind of a jerk move, but pretty cool, interesting instance of behavior. Now, it's kind of interesting though, the cuckoo birds, again, they trick another bird into raising their offspring, but their offspring doesn't learn the song of the actual rearing parent, but it actually learns the standard cuckoo song as a whole. So kind of a cool thing. Now, this leads us into cognition. Now, the question we can ask is, do animals show cognitive behavior, i.e., do they process information and respond to the way that suggests thinking? Now, we like to think of humans as being the ultimate thinkers, and that's true. I don't dis, disagree with that one bit. However, there's lots of ways we can go about thinking, because at the end of the day, thinking is a combination of observations as well as problem solving. So thinking is pretty widespread in the animal kingdom, as a note. And you could argue that even the most simplest organisms have the capacity to think in some fashion, even if it's not the way we think as in the way we think as a humans, right, with all our complex emotions and stuff like that. Now, chimpanzees show really interesting problem solving to get suspended bananas using boxes. Japanese macaques, which are related to chimpanzees and us as well, they learn to wash sand off potatoes before they eat them. Now, chips can pull the leaves off of a tree branch and use it as a tool for picking termites. Otters have learned to use rocks to crack clamshells, and ravens also show lots of problem solving, including using cars to break their seeds open and stuff like that. So pretty cool little set of cognition. And again, we can see the classical behavioral tools here. We have a chimpanzee using a stick to get insects, or an otter using a rock to crack open a clam to devour. So, and we can see the same example here where we have a chimpanzee, again, using box to get a set of hanging bananas. So problem solving is great, whether it's the chimpanzee, or we can see the raven untying a knot to get some food for itself. So pretty cool set of behavior, and animals are far more intelligent than we give them credit for. Certainly not as intelligent as humans, but again, a level of intelligence that you wouldn't quite expect for some of the simplest organisms on the planet. Now, there is a really interesting aspect of behavior, which is what we call orientation and migratory behavior. I'm sure you guys probably know migration is long-range two-way movements. So for instance, in the fall, ducks, geese migrate south and then return each spring. Monarch butterflies migrate from North America to Mexico. That takes 2 to 5 generations. So migration is a pretty cool thing. And we can see the monarch butterflies here. They fly all the way from Canada all the way down to Mexico, where they overwinter in these areas, and then they come back the following year. But again, it takes multiple generations to do this trip for the monarch butterflies. One of the most beautiful migrations out there. Really, really is. If you've never seen videos about the monarch butterfly migration, definitely pop that into YouTube. It's really fascinating. Now, look at another really interesting migratory behavior, what we call the bobolinks. This is what they look like. They're just a species of bird. Now, interestingly enough, where we have an established range here in red, and then we have the ancestral route here, and then we have this alternate route that's not taken. Now, it was interesting, if they establish these extended ranges, they actually don't bother to take the shortest path. They actually take this long path, where they actually go through their old native range all the way down to their winter range, and they come right back up the same way. So again, really interesting, where they have, again, this new range. They don't take the shortest path. They take the one that's sort of ingrained into them as well. Now, for any organism to be a migratory behavior, it's really the same way we drive as we go places as humans, right? You have to have orientation. You have to follow some sort of pairing, right? North, south, east, or west, or any direction in between. And you have to be able to navigate there, right? And the capacity to adjust your bearing as you go. Now, humans, we have maps and GPS and all that fun stuff. But animals, they're using things like the sun, stars, as well as the Earth's magnetic field to go these monstrous distances, right? Going from here all the way down to here is 4,000 miles plus in distance. So really long ways, again, only navigating by these natural cues, right? They don't have Google Maps, right, or Waze or anything like that. So it'd be kind of funny if they did, though. Now, migrating animals themselves are kind of interesting. So we'll talk about one particular instance here, which we call the starlings. These are what starlings look like. They're not exactly the most amazing bird, but they are certainly a good, interesting case study here. Now, their navigational abilities are interesting. Now, those that are inexperienced actually differ from those of adults that have made the journey before them. So it's actually kind of a cool thing. So we can look at their breeding range here, over here, and then they have their wintering range over here in the United Kingdom. And then we can see actually there's experimental relocation of all starlings down here to Switzerland. And then we can see the flight path of the experienced starlings here going up into Great Britain. And then we can see the flight path of inexperienced starlings going into Spain. So again, you didn't until they learned to go this way, they really didn't quite have a way to know, hey, I need to go to Great Britain instead of Spain. Though if I were to make my case, I'd probably want to go to the Mediterranean as opposed to going up to Great Britain, but that is just me. Now, that's just like behavior. These are the things they're doing. Now, one of the more fascinating aspects of biology is the capacity for communication. And it's really kind of an amazing thing. Now, we think of communication as in like, oh, I send a text message or I have a phone call or a face-to-face conversation with someone, but communication exists at all levels across the tree of life, whether it's basic communication of our microscopic organisms, all the way up to the very complex things that we do or birds do or crows do or whatever. Now, the reality is communication really has evolved as a means for successful reproduction. That's the reality of it. As I've sort of mentioned in this class before, the goal of all animals is just to reproduce. Now, if you can reproduce more effectively by communicating, then you're going to communicate. So this leads us to what we call the stimulus response chain, where the behavior of one individual releases a behavior by another individuals. And typically speaking, these are very species specific. So we can look at an example here where we have the sticklebacks. These are just really kind of teeny tiny fish. They're great evolutionary models. I don't know, I think they're kind of cute. Now we can see the female, she gives a little heads up display to the male. Then the male swims in a zigzag to the female and then leads her to her nest. The male shows the female the entrance to the nest. Then the female enters the nest and spawns while the male stimulates the tail, and then the male enters to fertilize the eggs. And again, this all happens because the female initiated behavior, which triggered behavior in the male, which led the female to do something, which led the male to do something, which led to the act of copulation to be completed. Now, this leads us to courtship signals. Now, this is what we talked about is technically not a courtship signal, though you could argue it is for a little bit, but courtship signals, in the case of fireflies, is actually a really great example. Now, the flashing of male fireflies is recognized by female flies, and the female's response is then recognized by males. Now, for instance, we have a couple different species of flies here, and again, just to make note, fireflies aren't like actual flies, like a housefly. They're beetles. They're just called fireflies, just as an FYI. So we have a bunch of different individuals here. And again, you can see there are these dark spots here is when they're flashing their lights so that they know to interact with one another. So we have 1 in 6 interacting. Again, they can only pick up each other's flashes. 1 in 7 are interacting. Again, they can pick up one another's flashes and so on and so forth. So again, allowing us to physically communicate with one another for the purposes of courtship. And I say we, I mean the animals that we were just discussing. Now, this leads us to pheromones, which are a pretty interesting classification of chemical messengers, and they're generally used for the communication between individuals of the same species, though there are plenty of pheromones that can be picked up by multiple species. Now, pheromones have a wide usage. They can be used for just sending a straight message, but pheromones are pretty heavily used as a sexual attractant. Now, males typically have sensory receptors, and many species, females also have the sensory receptors. The idea, all it is, a pheromone is just a chemical messenger. And some pheromones are so powerful, as I mentioned here, they can be picked up as far as 7 kilometers away, so quite a big distance away from when they are produced. But again, pheromones, great chemical messengers to allow an individual to communicate with someone of the same species or a different species without even the individual being there, right? 7 kilometers away is quite a distance. And then we can also look at what's called acoustic signals, i.e. the vocal calls, amphibians, birds, us, things like that. Now, why do we care about communication? Well, I mean, it certainly made humans very successful, but communication is a necessary thing for group living. Really is. Now, in the case of the ground squirrels here, prairie dogs here, we can have an example of this where guards set off an alarm so the group can seek shelter. Social insects can produce pheromones that trigger attack behavior. Ants will deposit trails of pheromones between nests and a food source, leading animals back and forth to food to nest. And bees actually perform some pretty complex dances to different hive mates to direct them towards different sources of food and nectar. And this is what we have here. We can actually really interestingly look at this bee. It will dance in a specific way to say, okay, I dance this way, the angle is 30 degrees, thus I'm telling you that there's food 30 degrees away from the sun. So really, really wild thing here. If you want to know more about this, definitely Google this. It's a really fascinating type of behavior of bees, just as a note. Now, primate communication, i.e. us and our closest relatives, is a really interesting group of communications because it's pretty complex relative to other things we've discussed. Now, for primates, we actually have a different vocabulary to communicate identity of specific predators. So in this case, we have a a lemur. No, that's not right. It's a type of monkey. I'm sorry, I forget what this is. I'll have to look it up. Where you have the frequency of the call, and you can see we have a different call for an eagle, a different call for a leopard, and a very different call from a snake. They all differ in their amplitudes. They also differ in their length. So again, you could think of this as like A, B, C, right? That level of different thing trying to communicate a different thing. So when I say, oh, look, there's a snake, that sounds, oh, look, there's an eagle, right? Two different communications to indicate different things. Now, there's a really interesting other type of behavior, which we'll look at, which is actually parental care. Now, poison dart frogs, which are a really awesome group of frogs. If you don't know about poison dart frogs, they're poisonous frogs, as you can tell by their really rich coloring. Usually when something is colored really brightly like this, it says it tells the other organisms, I'm poisonous, don't eat me. But parental care in poison dart frogs is really high. So what they will actually do is they'll find in trees these little puddles that form, and they'll lay eggs into these with their let their offspring hatch into these, and their parental care will actually be for them to bring food to these little things right here. Now, it's kind of interesting thing. It's phylogenetically distinct, where you can see different organisms are attending, transporting, or feeding. Other frogs, it doesn't exist, but you'll notice across these different species, whether it's Allobatus or Dendrobatus or Ophagia, so these three genera of poison dart frogs, parental behavior exists in both males and female individuals. So parental care is a pretty cool thing we see in poison dart frogs, not unique to us at all. Now, this leads us to a really interesting gentleman, Nico Tinberg. Now, Tinberg here is one of actually the founders of the field of what we call behavioral ecology, where he examines the actual adapted significance of behavior. Now, as we know, natural selection is operating not just on traits, but it actually operates on behavior as well, and thus it has the capacity to produce some level of evolutionary change. Now, Tinberg is known for doing a really interesting example where he actually he played with gulls. Now, he looked at their nestlings and how the parents removed the shells of the eggs. Now, what Tinberg did, he placed broken eggs by the nest, and predators and crows found the nest with broken eggs and ate the hatchlings. Now, nests without eggshells had less predation. So what he concluded from that eggshell removal behavior is adaptive. It reduces predation, thus increasing the chances of survival for the offspring, thus giving the organism more fitness from an evolutionary context. Now, the aspects of behavioral ecology that he asks is behavior adaptive? How is it adaptive? And how does it lead to greater reproductive success? I.e., does it involve enhanced energy take, increased mating success, or decreased predation? That's sort of the aspects we're going to tackle now. So let's talk about one specific aspect of that, which is foraging. Now, foraging behavior can directly influence individuals' fitness. Now, foraging involves an overall level of trade-off between food's energy content and the cost of attaining the food. Now, there is this theory, which we call the optimal foraging theory, that says natural selection does favor individuals whose foraging behavior is energetically efficient. Now, optimal foraging makes two overall assumptions. One, that natural selection does favor the behavior that maximizes energy acquisition if the increased energy reserves lead to increased reproductive success, i.e. avoiding predators while finding food. In addition, optimal behavior has evolved by natural selection. So for instance, the female zebra finches were successful at foraging, had successful offspring, and if you removed offspring to ensure learning was not a part of the foraging success. So again, that's our sort of idea here. Now we can actually look at an example of this where we have energy gain, and so the energy is in joules per second, and we have the number of mussels eaten per day, and then we have the length of the mussel, and we have a green crab here. So it's kind of a funky looking guy here, but he's trying to eat a mussel because they're tasty. Now, you can imagine if you're a green crab, you got these big claws. What are those big claws are for? Well, if you're a green crab, it's to crack open the shells of mollusks. Now, in this case, you can imagine there's a trade-off between how big a shell is and how hard it is to open. And if you made the assumption that the larger the shell, the harder it is to open, you would be absolutely right. And so you can imagine there's a sweet spot where it's if you use expending the energy to open a small shell just isn't worth it, right? It's just not enough energy for all the energy expenditure. But eventually, there's probably the sweet spot where the shell, it doesn't require too much energy, but um, but is easy enough to get open so you can maximize your energy. And you can see that here where there's, again, this is this little sweet spot where they don't need a lot of small ones, they don't need a lot of large ones, because again, the energy investment versus what you get out the back of it just simply isn't working. Now, territorial behavior is another aspect of this. Now, territorial behavior is something that secures resources, which again is an evolutionary fitness advantage. Now, we have what's called a home range, where animal lives and forages, i.e. where they defend. And they'll defend against intrusion from other individuals. Now, birds will actually sing or display their signal to their territory, but again, that is energy costly, so there has to be a benefit to maintaining your home range. But in this case, the benefit should be increased food intake, access to mates, or access to refuge from predators. Now, we can actually look at an example here where we have a bunch of different species, a bunch of different birds, where you have a bunch of different birds, and we go through and we remove some of these organisms, and then we see how the original birds, where they'll move in into sort of covering the territory that was essentially taken over. So you can see 10 expands its range, as does 9, 8, and so on and so forth. So organisms, if the space is there, will extend out. But again, competition for space is always a thing because, again, they're competing for resources. So as we see here with the hummingbirds, they're competing for space. Why are they competing for space? Well, they want the flowers that are in space. So they're competing for the resource, which will allow them to be more successful, i.e. get more energy. But that energy will also in turn allow them to be more sexually promiscuous, I guess that would be the word, i.e. producing more offspring. Now, what other determines territory size? Well, some species, the exclusive access to females is far more important than the territory size for males than food is. Now, sometimes several females in a territory are defended vigorously. And this is this is heightened in terms of during mating season. So during the non-mating season or the non-breeding season, the male territory size does decrease, and the aggression also decreases. But you can imagine during breeding season, those things completely turn on their own. Now, this leads us to an aspect of behavior which we call sexual selection. Now, where organisms select based upon reproductive strategies. Now, sexes have different reproductive strategies, and it depends on what they are. Now, females, typically speaking, do not mate with the first male that they encounter, which leads us to this concept of mate choice, where they evaluate the male's quality. Now, in the case of pheasants here, I'm sorry, peahens, sorry, I don't know why I said pheasants, they mate with males that have more eye spots in their tail. Conversely, we can see frogs mate with males that have more complex calls. So again, females are selecting for them. Now, because of this, mating systems have evolved to allow females and males to maximize their fitness, leading to 3 distinct mating systems: monogamy, where one male and one female; polygamy, one male and many females; or polyandry, which is one female and many males. So 3 distinct mating systems. But once the act of mating occurs, this leads to parental care, or the care of the offspring. Now, there is 2 distinct ways individuals might care, what we call altricial, which is the offspring require long care, needing both parents, i.e. in a monogamous relationship. This is what we have. You know, we have long care for our individuals as they're growing up. And then we have precocial, which is little care required, and it's very likely to be polygynous, i.e., multiple partners for single individuals. Now, in polyandrous systems, the males actually typically care for the young, while the females mate with many males. So kind of the opposite of what we see. Now, there's also a really interesting phenomenon here, which we're going to talk about briefly, which is called EPC, or the extra pair copulations. Now, in a study about red-winged blackbirds, we have these here in Massachusetts. They're just blackbirds with red spots on their wings. So if you go to like the Charles River, you see them all over the Charles River, just as an FYI. Now, in the red-winged blackbird study, half of all nests contained at least one hatchling fertilized by a male other than the territory owner. which is kind of weird, right? Where you have a male taking care of an individual that's not his own. Now, the evolutionary advantage of this is that males have increased reproductive success, whereas females that mated with genetically superior individual, even if they paired with another male. So kind of a cool thing, this. But again, we could look at this where we have a bunch of different mating um, ranges for blackbirds here. Again, not a very exciting bird here, but blackbird with red wings. And you can see that the females in this example have multiple mates, and again, they're moving between them for these multiple mates. But again, it allows the offspring to have multiple, to be produced from multiple parents, as you can see here in this gelotophoresis. We won't go too deep into it, but just to know that this is reinforcing what I've mentioned on the previous slide. Now, there are alternate mating strategies to what I've mentioned. Now, we have fish. Now, there are two genetic classes of males in many species of fish, large and small. Now, external fertilization makes males sneak into fertilized females. So sneaky males will basically, like when a male and a female are, doing the fertilization event, a sneaky male will come in and lay eggs, essentially adding his sperm to the mixture, even though he's genetically inferior technically. We also have dung beetles, where the territorial males have large horns, where small males don't have horns or territories, but they intercept females in tunnels, so they kind of cut females off at the pass. Now we have an interesting group here, which we have the side-blotched lizard. This is what it looks like. Now, there are three genetically based male strategies. There's the large territory with many females. There's the small territory with one female. And then there's the no territory with the sneaker males, i.e. the ones that sneak in and mate with a female in the territory of another male. So that's sex. Sex is clearly an important part of biology. It's certainly an important part of fitness, right? And certainly an important part of evolution. Now, this leads us to a really fascinating behavior that's not just experienced by humans, but we see it across multiple species. And this is called altruism, where you perform an action that benefits another individual at the cost to the actor. So, for instance, if I help my sister move, well, that benefits my sister, doesn't really benefit me, but I certainly help my sister. Thus, I'm displaying altruistic behavior or altruism. Now, altruism is something humans know pretty well, but again, it does exist in other species too, so don't think of altruism as a human-specific thing. Now, this leads us to group selection, where the selection acting upon a population or a species. Which is actually incorrect, because individuals that fail to secure mates and not breed will not leave any offspring. So it's not technically the correct way to say it, but it is commonly used to describe altruism. And some altruistic acts are actually selfish, i.e. you gain parenting experience or you inherit territory. So let's talk about a couple aspects of altruism, which we call reciprocal altruism, where partners in which mutual exchanges of altruistic acts occur because they benefit both participants. In this case, cheaters are discriminated against. And so, for instance, vampire bats, when one is sick, a vampire bat will share its blood meal with the other vampire bat, and when the other vampire bat becomes healthy again, it will then in turn share a blood meal with the person that helped it, or the bat that helped it, I should say. There's also kin selection, where there is an actual direct genetic advantage to altruism, i.e. Taking care of your offspring. Now, natural selection will inherently favor any behavior, including the sacrifice of one's own life, that increases the propagation of the individual's alleles. So giving your life to save an offspring is something natural selection does like. Now, there is what we call inclusive fitness, which considers gene propagation through direct and indirect reproduction, as well as Hamilton's rule, which is altruistic acts are favored when RB is greater than C, where B and C are benefits and costs, and R is the coefficient of relatedness. So again, we can mathematically describe it. Now, relatedness is an interesting topic in terms of altruism and kin selection. Now, JBS Haldane, he's a gentleman I gave you a quote of a previous lecture. He's the guy, the quote I gave you, the inordinate fondness for beetles guy. I don't know if you guys remember back from the animal talk, but JBS Haldane is an English naturalist, and he said he would lay down his life for his two brothers and/or his 8 first cousins. Now, the brothers each had a 50% chance of receiving the same allele, and the first cousin would share 1/8 of the alleles. So again, he would lay down his life for people that related to him as an evolutionary thing to pass down his genes which they would share to the next generation as well. And we can see that here. We can see parents, brothers, unrelated female, and first cousins, again, sharing genetic relatedness overall. Again, doing something for your brother or your sister to help pass on genetic traits, because again, it also passes on your traits. Now, bees experience this really interesting thing, which is called haplodiploidy. And bees are a eusocial hive. Now, what does eusocial mean? Well, I'm sure you guys probably know, like, bees have a single queen. The queen lays eggs. The eggs all hatch into females, and they all live to serve the female queen, basically. Now, so they have cooperative care of the brood, where the workers will propagate more of their own alleles by giving up their own reproduction to assist their mother in rearing the sisters. And female workers do this because they share about 75% of the alleles with the sisters that are produced. Now, interestingly enough, the males that are produced once a year are haploid. And overall, the queen does share 50% of her alleles with offspring. So again, we have the big queen here. With the worker bees around them, they all live to serve the queen, not because the queen is amazing or anything. All she's doing is laying eggs. But again, they share such a high similarity genetically with the eggs that are being laid that it's beneficial for them from an evolutionary perspective to allow them to take care of these eggs for the female, thus partially passing on their genes. Now, another interesting aspect of kin selection is actually in the white-fronted bee eaters. Now, males will often raise other males' young, which is kind of a weird thing, and these helpers actually choose to help their close relatives because, again, they are closely related. Thus, by helping their brother or their sister, they're helping pass their own genes as well. So we see this in human populations quite a bit, where grandparents or uncles and aunts will take care of someone to help out, say, a sibling or anything like that. Because again, I mean, it's not just a human thing, but there's also an evolutionary aspect to it, right? Where it's helping pass down genes to the next generation. Now, we have social systems, which I'm sure you guys probably know. It's not just unique to humans, but it's something we have for individuals in nature as well, where we have a society which is simply defined as a group of organisms that have the same species that are organized into a cooperative manner. Now, there is lots of advantages to living society: greater protection from predators, increased feeding success, potential of greater access to mates. Societal systems are pretty awesome. Now, insect social systems are by far the coolest, at least in my opinion, but I also really like insects, so it's pretty biased. I will say that's a pretty biased thing to say. Now, insect societies include individuals that are specialized for different tasks. Now, in ants, these are grouped into what we call castes, where individuals that differ in size as well as their morphology and form different roles. So, for instance, they have as well in honeybees and in leafcutter ants, we see workers who are basically doing the collecting of materials. So as you can see for leafcutter ants, that involves collecting materials. And then we also have soldiers, which are designed for protection, and they're much typically larger and help protect the colony from any potential predators or anything like that. Now, in vertebrate social systems, it's typically less rigidly organized and less cohesive overall than an insect one is. You can think about it, humans, right? We are loosely associated with one another, less well-defined. But again, we do have mobility in our caste system, whereas in ants or bees, if you're born a worker, you die a worker, right? So what leads to vertebrate social systems? Well, diet and predation is really important in terms of shaping social groups. So for instance, in the meerkat population, they'll always have a sentinel on duty, keeping watch out for predators. Now, naked mole rats are actually the exception to this rule, where they have a reproductive division of labor, and they have a single queen laying the individual's things. I was going to say eggs, but obviously mammals don't lay eggs. They lay the offspring each year. So typically speaking, you see this overall level of organization, but it's not as strong of organization in vertebrates as it is relative to some invertebrates. Now, this leads us to a second part of our talk, which is going to be the ecology of individuals as well as populations. This one is, depending on how much you like ecology, this might be interesting or it might be very boring. But let's dive in. Now, let's define ecology as a word. It's used a lot, but ecology simply is the study of organisms, how they relate to one another, as well as to their environments. And that's really it. How does an organism interact with the living parts and the non-living parts of its environment? That's what we mean by ecology. That's it. Now, the environment has a couple key aspects to it: water, temperature, sunlight, and soil. But there's other aspects to this depending on what organisms you have. Now, an organism, when it's in the environment, it's always trying to maintain what we call homeostasis, i.e. a steady state internal environment regardless of whether the environment is around it. Now, in the case of us, we maintain our normal temperature of 98.6 degrees, and we have this much water and this much stuff, right? That's our homeostasis. Now we can see a beetle here. It's living in a desert. It's collecting water to help it live in a very really dry environment. Again, trying to maintain an internal level of homeostasis. Now, some organisms are what we call conformers, where they adopt temperature or the salinity of their surroundings. So this is what bacteria and fungi do, and there are some animals that do this as well, but most animals are trying to maintain some level of homeostasis for them. Now, organisms can have different responses to the environment. They can be short or long term. Now, short-term responses are a few minutes to an entire individual's a few minutes to an individual's entire lifetime, and they vary in ways to cope. Now, long-term, whereas natural selection can operate to make a population better adapted to the environment. Because remember, natural selection doesn't just act on an individual, right? Evolution as a process and natural selection as a process act upon a population. Now, organisms have different coping mechanisms to their environment. First is physiological responses, where you can think of something as simple as sweating, right? Sweating is a response to it being hot outside, right? We can also see increased erythrocyte production, i.e. more blood cells, white blood cell production to make you better respond to a pathogen, or making something like antifreeze to make sure your body doesn't freeze if you're, say, a fish that lives in the Arctic. Now, there's also morphological capabilities, such as endotherms that have adaptations that minimize energy expenditure, i.e. a thick fur coat during winter. Remember, an endotherm, well, actually, I don't know if we've talked about this one, but an endotherm is something that produces its own heat, whereas an ectotherm relies on the environment to heat itself. We can also have behavioral responses where when an organism, say, moves from one habitat to another, i.e. it moves from the shade to the sun because it's cold, right? That level of coping. And so we can see this here. Behavioral response in our lizards here. It looks like our knolls, where we have body temperature and air temperature, and we have open habitat and shaded habitat. And you can see the body temperature, as you increase the air temperature, goes up in both of them, but in the open habitat it's significantly higher because, well, it's warmer because of the sun, right? So there's that. Then we can also see morphological capabilities, where we can see the thickness of fur in our wolves, where we see winter in blue, summer in orangey color, and we have the wolf here in this light color, and the polar bear in this gray color. And you can see the thickness of the fur increases during winter, giving more insulation, allowing them to survive in the winter versus in the summer. So again, behavioral response, i.e. move from the shade to the sun, or just growing a thicker coat of fur in terms of a morphological capabilities in our wolves or polar bear. Now, natural selection does lead to evolutionary adaptation to the environment, right? That's what natural selection says, right? Selecting for traits that benefit an individual in the environment. Now, we can actually compare closely related species that live in different environments and apply what we call Allen's rule, which is the rule of reduced surface area. So mammals from colder climates have shorter ears and limbs, whereas we'll see the exact opposite pattern in warmer climates, but we also see in desert frogs that have evolved a greatly reduced rate of water loss through their skin. But again, Allen's rule tells us that similar habitats produce similar environmental adaptations overall. So that's the individual. Now let's talk about the population, where populations are groups of individuals in one place at one time. Now when I say individuals, I mean of the same species. Now remember, species is kind of a hard word to define, but again, it's species as best we can say. Now there are three characteristics of population ecology that we'll discuss today. The first is the population range, which is the area throughout which a population occurs, the pattern of spacing of individuals, and as well as how the population changes in size throughout time. So the range, i.e. the limited geographic range by which an organism occupies. So for instance, we have the devil's hole pupfish. It actually lives in a single spring in southern Nevada. And that's in contrast to, say, like the eastern oyster here in the United States, which lives all up and down the eastern seaboard. Now, polar bears are another great example. They're great adapted for the Arctic, but you won't find them in the tropics. Why? Because they're adapted to the tropics and not, I'm sorry, they're adapted to the Arctic and not the tropics. Now, how do populations change? Well, it's typically through the environment. As the environment changes, populations change as well, and either increases or decreasing. But we can also see organisms moving as a result of inhospitable habitat to colonize better, more suitable habitat that was potentially previously occupied. We can also see humans affect the range of organisms as well, both through things like climate change, but also through hunting or providing waste, garbage for other individuals. So humans also play a role in expanding populations. So let's look at an example here where we see the northward expansion of trees. Now, the environment changed after the glaciers retreated in the last ice age, and plant and animal populations expanded northward. So we can look at 15,000 years ago before the last ice age, and you can see deserts here, woodlands, mixed conifer forests, spruce firs, and alpine tundra. The climate changed to present, where we see an expansion of grasslands, charcoal, and desert scrub, and as well as the expansion northward of spruce firs and things like that. So again, seeing a net increase in the population of these individual species of plants because of a change in the overall climate. I'll give you another example of this where we can actually look at the cattle egret. I think it's got a pretty cool hairdo. It looks like it's straight out of the 80s, at least in my opinion. But you can see its ranges. So you can see in the 60s, it's here in the United States, the 70s as well. But earlier, it started off here in the 50s, basically in Venezuela, in Colombia, I forget what else. Brazil. I think that's part of Brazil. I'm not the best geographer in the world, but I know Venezuela is there. Now, in the 50s, they actually expanded from this outward down into Chile and other places, and then up into the United States. Again, as climate has shifted over these past few decades. Now, how do organisms move? Well, if you're a bird, you fly, right? If you're a lizard, you can walk, right? If you're something big, you can walk long distances. But how do plants move? Well, as we talked about in the plants lecture, there's many mechanisms by which plants can disperse their young. In this particular, we're thinking about seeds, right? Thinking about seeds, right? And so seeds disperse in a wide variety of fashions, whether it's delicious fruit that something eats and poops out, or you have something that adheres to the skin or the fur of an individual that gets carried a great distance away, or things that get picked up by the wind or water currents and carried a long time away. Now you might ask yourself, how do you get to an island? Well, you can float down a river, or you can float on a piece of wood or a tree out to an island to colonize a new area. Now, individuals and populations exhibit different, what we call spacing patterns. Now, there are three distinct types of spacing patterns. Random spacing, where individuals do not interact strongly with one another, and it's not actually really common in nature. Intraspecific competition is kind of a pretty common thing for most species. We have uniform spacing, where behavioral interactions and resource competition lead to a relative uniform spacing. And then we have clump spacing, where it's uneven distribution of resources that are causing all the organisms to basically come together. This is actually pretty common in nature. Most resources aren't well spread out. They're pretty dispersed. They're pretty clumped in one space, so it causes species to come together. Now, we can define what we call a metapopulation. Now, a metapopulation is a kind of a fancy word, but we'll just walk through what it means here. So a metapopulation basically occurs when a suitable habitat is patchily distributed and is thus separated by intervening stretches of suitable habitat. I'm sorry, of unsuitable habitat. So metapopulation would be like, I have on one side of the highway, I have a population of deer, and on the other side of the highway, I have another population of deer. We could define that as a metapopulation. Now, dispersal within these metapopulations might not be symmetrical, and populations have the capacity to increase and send out many dispersers, whereas smaller populations have very fewer dispersals, and individual populations might become extinct, and population bottlenecks also might occur as well. So again, metapopulations in patchy habitat distributed, say again, on two sides of a highway, leading to two distinct populations, but again, they're connected overall, so they are technically considered what we call a metapopulation. Now, We have what are called source sink metapopulations, where some areas are actually suitable for long-term habitat, where others are not. Now, in the population in beta areas, source bolster the population in the poorer areas, the sink. So if I have a really, really nice patch of forest and it's got a lot of resources, and then next to it I have a really, really poor patch of forest, well, organisms, because of the space in the poor one, might eat food in the nice, happy forest and then go to the less happy forest to live and do their things as well. So that's our source sink here. Now we can see this here in our Glanville fritillary butterfly, where none of the populations themselves is large enough to survive for very long on its own, but continual immigration of individuals from other population allows some populations to survive. So you can see the blue is an occupied patch, and the red is an unoccupied patch. And again, we have this mixing of these, allowing populations to sort of stay afloat. Now, how can we describe a population? Well, we can describe a population by demography, which is the quantitative the quantitative study of population and how it changes over time. Is the population increasing, decreasing, remaining constant? And how can we break down these population into different parts by age, by birth or death rates of specific individuals? Now, population growth can be influenced by the population sex ratio. So you can imagine the number of births is directly related to the number of females. The more females you have, the higher potential birth rate you have, because females are doing all the birthing. Now, generation time also influences population dynamics as well. Shorter times means you can produce more offspring. Short generation times means you can produce more offspring. Longer generation times mean you can produce less offspring. But let's look at this. There's actually a really interesting relationship between body size and generation time, where as we start very, very small with the bacteria, we move up into the protists and the fungi, into the insects, and into bigger things, and all the way up to the monsters of giant sequoias out there. What you'll notice is as we increase our body size here, as does the generation time as well. And so you can see the biggest things on the planet have generation times of decades, right? And the sequoia is pushing close to 100 years. So really, really fascinating relationship, body size and generation time. Now, how do we describe the demography of a organism? Well, we do it by the age structure, and this is determined by the number of individuals in a different age group. Now, we define this as a cohort, which is the group of individuals at the same age or near the same age. We have the fecundity, which is the number of offspring produced in a standard time. The mortality, which is the death rate. And then the age structure itself has essentially a critical influence on a population's growth rate. So let's look at a table here where we have the table of the annual bluegrass. It's Poa annua for a cohort containing 843 seedlings. So we can see the age in months in 3-month intervals. So this would be like 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, and so on and so forth. The number that are alive at the beginning of the time interval, the proportion of the cohort alive, so 1 is 100%. The deaths during that interval, the mortality rate, the seeds produced surviving, i.e. the fecundity, and then the seeds produced per member of the cohort, which is fecundity times survivorship. And again, you'll notice that over time, the proportion surviving goes down. By the time you reach to cohort number 8, where survivability is essentially 0. And so because of this, we can look at 2 key things. First is survivorship, which is the percentage of an individual population that survives to a given age. And so we can see this here as expressed as a survivorship curve, where we have the proportion of the original population surviving and the percentage of maximum lifespan. So 100% is the maximum lifespan, right? If that is 100 years, 100% is 100 years, right? And you'll notice we have 3 distinct curves here, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Now, type 1 is what humans exhibit, where you have low mortality early on and high mortality later on. But again, lots of things living to old age. We have type 2, which is many things, including hydra and birds and reptiles, where it doesn't really matter how old you are, you're equally as likely to die. And then we have something like type 3, which is the oysters or mice or weedy plants, where you have high mortality early on and not a lot of things live to early age. And so that's how we interpret these 3 survivorship curves overall. It's important to know what they mean and how to interpret them. It's always a great exam question, just as a FYI. Now this leads us into another topic, which we call life history, where natural selection does favor traits that maximize the number of surviving offspring left in the next generation by an individual organism. And 2 factors affect this quantity and they are how long the individual lives and how many young it produces on a yearly basis. This is how we define our life history. Now, it is a complete life cycle of an organism, and so we can look at the number of offspring per year and the adult mortality rate per year. You'll notice that the more you produce, offspring you can produce, the higher the adult mortality rate gets. But again, there is this trade-off here between the limit of resources versus increased reproduction overall. Now, the cost of reproduction is important. Now we can look at an example here where we have the collared flycatchers. Now they have a really interesting study on them. Now this experiment demonstrated that there was a trade-off between the current reproductive effort and the future reproductive success. So the clutch size the following year and the change in the clutch size. And as you'll see, as the clutch size the following year, as that goes down, the change in clutch size decreases. But the more they invested in reproduction in one year, the less reproductive output they would have the following year. So again, there is a trade-off, there is a cost to reproduction, and there's also a cost to the survival of the offspring. Now, in terms of our friend natural selection here, the number of offspring produced is not as important as how many of those offspring themselves survive. Now, there is a balance between the number of offspring and the size of the offspring, whereas larger offspring have a greater chance of survival, but producing many small offspring may result in very low survival rates. And so we can look at an example here of birds. We have the nestling size in grams and the clutch size here. And as you increase the nestling size, the amount of clutch you have is low. But again, as you decrease this in essentially a little bit of an exponential pattern here, you see that as you increase clutch size, the size of your offspring decreases as well. So the idea that even though I produce 13 offspring, they're all smaller than if I only produce, say, 2 offspring, but the probability of 13 surviving is way lower than the probability of 2 surviving. Why? Well, it just requires more resources to raise 13 individuals than it does to raise 2 individuals. Now, there's another trade-off here in terms of maternal yolk. So what nourishes a developing individual? So organisms that produce only 1 offspring at a time, they produce very, very nutritious yolk. I.e., they have larger babies when they're born. Those that produce very many offspring produce much less nutritious yolk because, again, you have to spread the love around. Now, the age at first reproduction also correlates with lifespan. Now, species that are very long-lived have delayed reproduction. Why is that? Well, juveniles, when they're younger, they gain experience for the high cost of reproduction, whereas short-lived species reproduce early because time is important to them, and any delay to their reproduction might lead to no offspring or very, very few offspring overall. Sorry. So let's talk about some math, because why wouldn't we want to talk about math? Now, there are environmental limits to population growth. Now, populations often remain the same size regardless of the number of offspring born. Now, we can describe exponential growth of a population with a simple equation where we have R equals B minus D plus I minus E. Now, R is the rate of population increase, B is the birth rate, D is the death rate, I is immigration, and E is emigration. So immigration coming in, emigration leaving, birth rate minus death rate plus what comes in versus what comes out. So a really, really simple way, but to define R, which is the rate of population growth. Now, we can also define another mathematical equation, which is the biotic potential, which is E is equal to I, and there are no limits on population growth. Then we look at dN over dt, where N is the number of individuals in the population. So we're doing the derivative of N, i.e. the rate of change over time, equals Ri, which is Ri is the intrinsic rate of natural increase for the population, i.e. the innate capacity for growth, and that Ri is multiplied by N. So that's the biotic potential. What is the maximum number of individuals you can produce without any limits to your population? Which leads us to our final, not our final thing, but another aspect of this, which leads to what we call carrying capacity. Now, the biotic potential of any population is exponential technically, even when the rate of increase remains constant. As a result of unchecked exponential growth is what we call a population explosion. Now, all populations eventually reach what we call a limit, which we define as the carrying capacity due to a shortage of some resource. Now, carrying capacity, which we symbolize as K, is the maximum number of individuals that the environment can support. Now, we looked at the exponential growth, which is here, i.e. biotic potential. This leads us to the logistic growth, which is dn over dt equals r times n times k, Rn times k minus n divided by k. Now, dn over dt is equal to the intrinsic rate of natural increase, which is adjusted for the amount of available resources. And then we've already defined Rn, k, and n as well. K being that the carrying capacity, right? Now, if you plot n versus t, you actually obtain what we call a sigmoidal curve. So let's look at dn over dt, which is exponential growth. We get what's called a classical J curve, where we see population size as it increases, as the amount of generations increases. Thus, we get an exponential growth curve. That's in contrast to our logistic growth curve here. Again, technically it's also called a sigmoidal growth curve, but we're just going to call it logistic growth curve, where again, we have a brief period of exponential growth, but it plateaus at the carrying capacity. Again, carrying capacity being the maximum amount of individuals a given area can support. Now, as n approaches k, the rate of population growth begins to slow. And if n equals k, the population growth rate is 0. So if the population itself exceeds k, then the population size will eventually decline until k is reached, I should say. So we can look at positive growth rate here, negative growth rate here, below k, at k, or above k. You notice that the growth rate changes depending on where you are. So if you overshoot k, you crash. If you undershoot k, you'll eventually come to meet k. But again, every population aims to exist at about k. And so we can see this for logistic growth in the number of fur seals. You can see it increases, hits the carrying capacity, and plateaus. You can see the example here. We have a copepod here. It's called the cladoceran. They increase, they eventually hit some level, they eventually overshoot some level of K. K is probably around here somewhere in this model. They overshoot it, but they crash back down, and then they come back up to approach K. So you can overshoot K, but eventually you're going to crash, right? So as long as you hit K, you're A-okay. Too much over K, you crash. Too little under K, you'll increase until you eventually hit K or exceed K, in which case you'll crash down back to K. But again, k is this magical number. Well, maybe not a magical number, but it's a number defined by the amount of resources. And k is different depending on different species. So something like, you'll notice the difference between seals here, where k is close to 10, right? Whereas in copepods, k is close to about 350, right? So very different, carrying capacities depending on different organisms. Now this leads us to density. Density is simply referring to how many organisms you pack into a single area. So if a place that's high density has a lot of individuals packed into a small area, a place that is low density has very few individuals packed into a large area. Now, this leads us to two distinct factors, density dependent and density independent factors that affect population growth. Now, density dependent factors rely upon how dense the population is. So the more dense the population, the stronger the effect of density dependence is. Now, that's in contrast to density independent factors, where such as natural disasters, floods, stuff like that, they affect the population regardless of size. So it doesn't matter how dense they get. So we can see three examples here. We have they affect the birth rates, affect the death rates, and affect the birth and death rates. We can see as population increases in density this way, we see an increase from low to high in terms of birth rates or death rates or so on and so forth. But you see that the density independent birth rate decreases, whereas the density independent death rate is not affected at all. And there's some level of equilibrium. We see the exact opposite pattern here, affecting death rates versus nothing here for density independent ones. And then you see the affecting birth rates and death rates. Again, you see the overall change here. So again, density independence doesn't matter. It's like a flood or a fire, something that doesn't matter how dense your population is, it just happens. Conversely, something that is density dependent, as your population gets more dense, i.e. You get more individuals per unit area, factors such as disease, famine, predation, competition set in, thus limiting your factors. Now we can see an example of this here. We see the number of young per female and then the juvenile mortality rate. As we increase the number of adults, the number of young per female decreases. But as we increase the number of breeding adults, the juvenile mortality increases as well. So again, this is a level of density dependence in our sparrows here. So how does this lead back to thinking about populations? Well, at high populations, we'll use an example of the locust. Now, they have different hormonal and physiological characteristics that and actually take off as a swarm. And so they have what's called positive feedback, or what we call allele feedback, where their growth rate increases with population size. So kind of a weird thing. But for those of you that have ever seen those swarm of locusts, or maybe if you've ever read the Bible and you've read the swarms of locusts in the Bible, this is what locust looks like. But locusts, unlike most organisms, when they get really high densities, they actually grow faster. Whereas density-dependent factors tell us that should decrease growth rate. However, locusts have the exact opposite effect, where they have this weird mechanical switch in their brain that when they get really high density, they swarm, they go crazy in breeding, as you can see here in this kind of weird locust orgy, again, causing their populations to explode, leading to huge population gains. Now, density independent factors is, again, stuff that's environmental. Cold winters, droughts, storms, volcanic eruptions, climate change, right? It's things that affect you no matter how dense your population is. So the rate of growth of a population at any instant is limited by something unrelated to the size of the populations. And populations display erratic growth because of these events. So we can look at an example of here. These are pupae of 4 moss species in Germany, but it's the same factor regulates the population size of different species. And you'll notice all of them, they have a relatively similar uh, sort of boom and bust cycle of the populations. It's kind of, across all 4 genuses, you see that the number of pupa per meter squared changes pretty predictably, pretty similarly across all of them. As one goes up, usually see the other one go up as well. Now, let's talk about another example, which we have the snowshoe hare, pretty cute little organism. Now, the American snowshoe hare has a 10-year cycle, and the population numbers fall 10-fold to 30-fold in a single cycle, and 100-fold changes can occur. And the 2 factors that generate this cycle are food plants as well as predators. So let's look at this because it's a really classic example where we have from C. Krebs, so 1992, he actually set up this really cool experimental plots to determine if overharvesting of plants by hares or increased lynx population cause oscillations of populations. So it's a pretty cool thing where we can look at the number of pellets in thousands, i.e. poop. I'm sorry, pelts. Sorry, I don't know why I say pellets. That makes no sense. The number of pelts, i.e. individual seed capture, and you can see the year over time. You'll see that as the lynx population decreased, the population of the snowshoe hare increased. But as the lynx population increased, the population of hares crashed. And they kind of do this back and forth dance with one another. Whereas one increases, typically the other decreases, and vice versa. And there is some overlap here. But again, there is a level here of interaction of the populations of hares and lynxes together. Again, the populations are changing in response to one another. Now, ultimately, the biggest thing here in terms of how populations grow is resources. Now, resources are water, food, space, nutrients, things like that. But resource availability affects all life history adaptations. Now, when resources are limited, the cost of reproduction is high. So selection will ultimately favor individuals that can compete and utilize resources efficiency and can lower reproductive rates. Now, in those that are what we call case-selected population, they're adapted to thrive when the population is nearing carrying capacity. Now, we'll talk about these 2 distinct types of populations, K and R selected populations. Now, R selected populations are populations that are far below the carrying capacity and where resources are abundant and the costs of reproduction are low. Now, in R selected population, selection favors individuals with the highest reproductive rates, and most individuals in these natural populations show life history adaptations that exist along a continuum of R and K selected traits. But let's look at a table here. Really like this. I really like this little table where we have the adaptation, R-selected populations, i.e. fast-growing ones, and K-selective populations, i.e. slow-growing ones. The classical example for here is the mouse and the elephant for K and R-selected populations. We have age at first reproduction is early for R-selected, late for K. The lifespan is short-long. Maturation time is short-long. Mortality rate is high-low. Number of offspring is many-few, and so on and so forth. So we have this really handy table. 2 distinct groups of organisms, R-selected and K-selected. Now, human population growth is a really interesting case of K-selected growth because we are a K-selected species because we have small brood size, relatively late reproduction, and a very high degree of parental care. Now, the reality is there's been many, many things since the 1700s, i.e. the Industrial Revolution, that has allowed humans to escape logistic growth, i.e. overshoot our carrying capacity, and human populations have thus expanded exponentially. Now, the birth rate has remained unchanged, though has been steadily decreasing over time, and the death rate has actually fallen dramatically. So let's look at human population growth over time. We can see the billions of people. We could see over time up until the bubonic plague, where you see a huge dip. Then in the 1700s, you see we're starting on this upturn of this exponential growth. The Industrial Revolution kicks, all this cool technology comes. Then in the 1900s, we see some pretty cool advances in public health, and our population explodes. Um, and we see this pretty consistently across the planet. Africa, huge explosions. Asia, huge explosions. Not just now, but heading into the future. A little bit in Australia, a decline in Europe. We expect to see an increase in North America, an increase in South America as well. So again, projections from 2005 and projections to 2050. But again, exponential growth is what the human populations are seeing. Now this leads us into what we call the population pyramid, which is a bar graph displaying the number of people in each category. Now we can look at a comparison between Sweden and Kenya. Now, Sweden, you'll notice, has a smaller population of younger individuals, a pretty beefy middle group, and a relatively sizable older group. That's in direct contrast to Kenya, which has a very, very high amount of younger folk, a pretty beefy, reproductive age group, and a very small amount of older people. And we can actually see that Kenya's population could double in less than 35 years, whereas Sweden, given this population structure, or population pyramid, I should say, will actually remain relatively stable. Again, why is Kenya's growing? Well, they have a lot of young people. A lot of young people means lots of potential future babies, thus lots of future population growth. Now, what has fueled human population growth? Well, Earth's rapidly growing population is actually one of the sort of the weirdest thing. In theory, we should be more in tune with nature, but all of our cool technology has really allowed us to escape what our normal carrying capacity probably should have been. Now, in addition to sort of our way we're growing, it's actually going to pose some pretty severe threats to our biosphere as a whole. And we'll talk about that in our conservation lecture in a few classes. But this has led to a really uneven distribution um, of resources among countries and between countries. It's also led to increasing gap between rich and poor countries, and also led to the world's ecosystem being under heavy level of stress, and leading us to ask the question, what is the carrying capacity for the human population? What is K? The reality is we don't quite know. We have some ideas, but we don't quite know what the maximum amount of humans is going to be. But if you want to learn a little bit more about this, I definitely would read Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population. It's a really fascinating look at this idea of what K is. But we can see the effects of economic development here. With the United States, Brazil, and Ethiopia, high, moderately, and poorly developed areas. And you can see the fertility rate is much higher in Ethiopia versus other ways. The population growth is much higher. The doubling rate of the population is higher in developed countries, and so on and so forth. So again, economic development is a big thing. And again, distribution of population growth of humans is really unevenly distributed, where we have developed countries don't have a very large amount of population growth occurring, whereas lots of population growth is occurring in developed countries overall. Now, the world population growth rate is declining. It was 2% from 1965 to 1970. In 2015, population growth was 1.1%. Actually, population growth this past year was actually less than 1%. But 1% is still a lot of people. It's about 75 million to 85 million people per year. So again, it's a lot of people, but in terms of the total numbers of people, it's not a huge amount as a percentage of population growth. Now, what is limiting human population growth? Well, the reality is it's consumption. And in particular, consumption in the developing world does further deplete our resources. Now, don't get me wrong, consumption is not equally distributed among the planet. The wealthy consume about 20%. The wealthiest 20% of the world consumes about 86% of all the resources and produces about half of all CO2 emissions. So don't for a second think I'm letting the wealthy off the hook here, because certainly the depletion of the world's resources is directly tied to the wealthiest countries. However, as the less wealthy countries expand in their population, they too will put greater pressure on our biosphere, which leads us to this what we call the ecological footprint, which is the amount of productive land required to support an individual at the standard of living at a population throughout the course of his or her life. So we can look at the acres of land required to support an individual in the US, Germany, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia, and India. You can see the number of acres in the United States is really high at about 23, 10 in Germany, 5 in Brazil, and then 2 in India. So again, our ecological footprint, being in the United States, being the wealthiest country on the planet, is significantly higher than in places like Africa or Southeast Asia, where the ecological footprint is in fact lower. Now we'll come back and talk about this ecological footprint in a later lecture when we talk about um, conservation biology and things like that. But that's going to be the end of today's lecture. I do hope you guys learned a little bit something. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, have a great day.